Now, members will take leaders' questions under Standing Order 29, and I call on Deputy Stephen Donnelly, please.
Ken Corla. Minister, business people from the border regions came to the Oireachtas yesterday to tell us how Brexit is affecting them. Now, one tourism company in Wicklow said it has cut its UK visitor forecasts in half and believes that Brexit has already cost several thousand jobs in the industry. A sheep and beef farmer in Fermanagh told us that by the time the UK leaves the EU, he will have relocated his business to within the EU. And a transport operator from Antrim said that if the talks proceed to phase 2, to the future relationship, without the Irish border being sorted, then he will have to pull his business out of Northern Ireland. The Minister, we're all aware, obviously, that these negotiations are delicate and they're ongoing, and we welcome agreement in principle on areas like the Common Travel Area. But on the question of Northern Ireland and the border, there has been little progress. It has been agreed by all of us, by the Taoiseach, by Prime Minister May, by Michel Barnier, that there cannot, under any circumstances, be a return to the borders of the past. Yet the UK Government insists that Northern Ireland will leave the single market, will leave the customs union, will not have a unique or special status, and will not have equivalence of regulations for all products. Now, as you know, Minister, a European Commission paper leaked just a few days ago states that in the opinion of the Commission, what the UK Government is insisting for Northern Ireland will lead inevitably to border controls and a hard border, and many other experts have reached the same conclusion. Now, the greatest influence Ireland has in the Brexit talks is on whether sufficient progress has been made on the question of Ireland and the Northern Ireland border to allow the Brexit talks move to phase 2, to talks of a future trading relationship. And at the European Council meeting in October, the Irish Government's position was that insufficient progress had been made on the Irish questions to allow the talks to proceed. But just last week, Minister, the Taoiseach stated that he now believes that the talks can move to phase 2 in December. Now, it's unclear what additional progress has been made on the border to change the Government's position on this critical issue. So much so, Minister, that just a few days after the Taoiseach made a statement, Michel Barnier warned that EU member states need to start preparing for a collapse of the Brexit talks. Now, for many business people preparing for Brexit, Minister, on both sides of the border, the Irish Government's position is unclear. So can I ask you the following question? Does the Irish Government still believe that the Brexit talks are likely to move to phase 2 in December? If that is the position of the Irish Government, could you let us know what progress has been made since the October summit that has changed the Government's position? And if that is no longer the Government's position, could you outline for us, Minister, even at a high level, what sufficient progress on the Northern Ireland border would look like for the Government to accept that sufficient progress has been made? Thank you.
Minister.
Yeah, I'd like to thank the Deputy for raising this question. As you know, the Taoiseach today is flying to Sweden for an EU summit, and he will be meeting not only with other European colleagues, but particularly with a bilateral with the Prime Minister Theresa May. The position of the Irish Government remains unchanged. We believe that there has to be, before we can proceed to the next stage, there has to be a clear roadmap to achieve what has been announced as the objective of all parties, and that is not to return to a hard border. And that means that has been an agreed approach by the UK, by the European Union and by ourselves. So there is clearly a view of what we need to achieve here, and I think the Irish Government's view is very clear. We need to see a roadmap to that, to deliver that. And as the Deputy has rightly said, a number of the pronouncements by politicians in the UK would be inconsistent with achieving that. So clearly the Irish Government's position is that we need to have a clear roadmap before we move to the next stage. Now, of course, we are conscious also that the next stage is vitally important to the very businesses you are describing in the initial comments that you made. We do need to have long-term stable trading arrangements with the UK. But we are very clear that before we move to the next stage, which would be to enter into the detailed negotiations on what form those trading relations should take, it is important that the Irish border issue, which is one of the 3 issues that have to be dealt with before progress to the next stage, that we have a satisfactory roadmap put in place. And that remains the Irish Government's position, and I think both the Taoiseach and Simon Coveney, the Minister for Foreign Affairs, have been very clear in articulating that to colleagues.
Mr. Deputy Donnelly.
I think part of the problem is, or the concern that the businesses have, Minister, is that this statement that we need to see a roadmap is very vague. And whilst I take you at your word that the Irish Government's position has not changed, to the businesses and to a lot of us looking on at the negotiations, it appears the Irish Government's position did change, because in October the position was insufficient progress had been made, and just last week the Taoiseach said that he now expected the talks to move on to phase 2 in December, suggesting that he believed sufficient progress would be made. So can I ask you specifically, do you agree with the European Commission's position that should the UK insist on leaving the customs union and the single market, that it is inevitable that there would be border controls, and as such, on the basis that we are all agreed that there can be no border controls, is it the Irish Government's position that if the UK in December insists that it is still going to leave the single market and the customs union, that the Irish Government will at that point deem that insufficient progress has been made?
Thank you, Deputy Minister.
Well, I think the Deputy will be aware that either I or indeed the Taoiseach or the Minister for Foreign Affairs seeking to answer a set of hypothetical questions about what the British might do and what we might do in return could not be to our advantage in a very delicate situation like this. It's not for us to play with scenarios and suggest that we would settle for something less than has been set out from the outset. This is very clear. This is one of the issues that needs to be satisfactorily resolved to the satisfaction of both sides before we move to the next stage. And I don't think it would serve those very business interests that you rightly express concern for if Ireland were to be outlining a set of possible solutions or insisting that Britain have this or that piece in their jigsaw. We need to see what the British come forward with. They have pledged very clearly that they want no return to the border. We clearly want no return to a border, and we have to show that the approach that Britain will be taking and that the EU will be taking before we need to move to the next stage is consistent with that. So, while I can understand people would like to see what if this, what would happen then, I don't think it is in our interest to be articulating alternatives of that nature in public.
Thank you very much, Minister. Deputy David Cullinan, please.
Minister, precarious work and if and when contracts is a problem for many workers in this state. It creates uncertainty in terms of pay and also how many hours a worker will do from week to week. It leads to exploitation in the workplace, a hollowing out of workers' rights and deep anxiety and stress for the workers involved. We know, and you know, Minister, from your previous brief, that many of these workers actually do 30 hours a week for years, and yet are left on lower 15-hour contracts. This has an impact on access to social welfare payments, an ability to get a mortgage and an ability for these workers to provide for their families. These are workers, Minister, who do get up early in the morning, but they do so with uncertainty hanging over their heads. On Monday, the Mandate Trade Union launched a Secure Hours and a Better Future Charter. Are you aware of that charter, Minister? It is calling on all TDs to sign the charter. Will you and your ministers sign the charter? Yesterday, the Taoiseach accused my party of playing politics with people's misery and of not being solution-focused. You know that's absolute nonsense, Minister, and it's a desperate attempt by the Taoiseach, time and again, to avoid responsibility for problems created by your government. But let's look at this issue. Last July, I brought forward a bill to address the issue of if and when contracts and to bring about fairness. The essence of the bill was to ensure that a worker's contract simply reflects the errors that they actually do. These are workers in the hospitality sector, the retail sector and other sectors as well. The bill was an earnest attempt to provide a solution. And what was the response of your government, Minister? It was to oppose the bill and to pretend that the problem does not exist. The bill passed, however, and it was fully scrutinised by the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Jobs, Enterprise and Innovation. The committee spent 13 hours over 6 sessions hearing from 44 witnesses, and in the end it produced a report that made 23 amendments and recommendations. What was the government's response? To produce a bill of your own. But your bill, Minister, is woefully inadequate. It will not ban zero-hour contracts, the bans are too broad and the look-back period is too long. So my questions, Minister, are this. First of all, do you accept the report from the sectoral committee, the Committee for Jobs, Enterprise and Innovation, and the amendments that they suggest? I do, and I will support them. Will you ensure once and for all that exploitation in the workplace in terms of if and when contracts becomes a thing of the past? Will you support the Sinn Féin bill? But also, will you and your fellow ministers and Seachta Dáil from your party sign the mandate charter for secure hours and a better future for workers?
Thank you, Minister.
First of all, I roundly reject the suggestion that we're pretending this problem doesn't exist. It was our government, and indeed I with the then Minister Jed Nash, who commissioned the work by the University of Limerick on zero-hour contracts. And it is on the back of that work that we've held consultations, not only with the trade union movement, but also with the employers, to ensure that we can bring forward legislation. That legislation has already been announced in terms of the heads of the bill, and we're moving now into the proper legislative phase. Let me also say that one of the issues here is we've seen, because of the recovery in the economy, a very considerable reduction in the involuntary part-time working. That was a very serious problem, but thankfully is reducing. So we are seeing progress in this. We're seeing less of these self-employed contracts being put in place. But we want to make sure that we protect precarious workers, and we're bringing forward legislation in this area. We're also, as you know, bringing forward protections for people who are in self-employed situations. And many people in the course of the recession entered into self-employment not out of their own choice. And we're introducing new protections for such people, including protection of an invalidity pension, access to treatment benefit, access to paternity leave, and it's very clear that the government is keen to extend further protections to people, not only those who are in precarious work under employers, but also those who find themselves in self-employed positions. So we want to make sure that hard work is rewarded, that people are protected. We want to see improvement in the living standards. And I recognise, like others, that the gig economy and those changes that are taking place in our economic framework call for better protections both from social insurance perspective and better protections from employment law. And I was part of a government that brought in very significant improvements to protect temporary agency workers, to improve the minimum wage, to protect where the courts had struck down the registered employment agreements. We have refurbished employment law so that workers can be protected, and I recognise that this is an area that we have to move on, and it was our government, and indeed I acknowledge Jed Nash's role in this, who took the initiative to put us in a position to implement legislation now.
Well, you have not answered my questions at all, Minister. Surprise, surprise. The University of Limerick study that you mentioned, the bill that you are proposing is not in line with that report and its recommendations. What that report actually committed to was a 6-month look back. So somebody's hours in their contract would be reflective of the hours that they do over a 6-month period. You were looking at an 18-month period. The bans that you suggest are also too broad to make the bill almost insignificant. So you are not dealing with the problem at all. And to my astonishment, you say that bogus self-employment is not an issue. We had a report from a reporter from RTE that is even an issue in RTE. It's rampant across many sectors. So I'm afraid your head is in the sand, Minister, on this. And the straight question I asked you was that will you sign mandates pledge and mandates charter to ensure that we have secure hours, because I'm afraid, Minister, if your bill passes, then that will not be any comfort to those workers who are being exploited. When there's a bill already there, and we will debate this bill tonight, and a report which comes from a sector committee, why not do that? Why not support that bill, progress that bill, implement that bill, and ensure that workers have full protection and not partial protection, which is what you and your government want to provide?
Thank you very much. Minister.
The position is, it's the responsibility of government to bring in legislation that's practical and can be applied and is feasible for all concerned, and that's what we're doing. And our legislation will ban zero-hour contracts. It will introduce protection for people who are on short-hour contracts, giving them recognition for the fact that they are often working longer periods than are specified in the contract. This will allow people to get recognition for that longer hours, so that when they are going to get mortgages, as you rightly say, they have a contract that reflects the actuality of the hours that they work. We're also ensuring that there will be a system of banded hours, as you say. Of course, Mandate or any other group can put forward to the committee who will be considering that legislation possible amendments, and it is for the House to consider amendments in the normal course of events. The way in which we legislate is not by signing the requests of various outside bodies. We are elected here to represent people. We come here, we make decisions on the merits of the cases put forward, and the merits of a case put forward by Mandate will of course be examined by the House when this bill is presented to the House for debate and adoption.
Thank you very much, Minister. Deputy Catherine Connolly, please.
Minister, this is the third use of my leader's questions in just over 3 months to raise the issue of the need and the urgent need for a SAVI report, the Sexual Assault and Violence in Ireland report. I raised it in June or July, I raised it again in October. In addition, such is the seriousness and significance of the issue that has been raised by many deputies in this stall, including Deputy MacDonald, Deputy Coppinger, Deputy Shortall, at leaders' questions, as well as any amount of Dáil questions tabled by TDs, including Deputy O'Leary, Deputy Ann Rabbitte. In fact, almost every political grouping in this stall has asked for a SAVI 2. Indeed, Deputy Martin launched the original SAVI 1 when he was Minister for Health in 2002, and one of the essential recommendations in that report is that there would be a follow-up research. Moreover, the Taoiseach and her own positive work on the ground has been recognised by the organisations, and back in September 16, more than a year ago, she confirmed to Deputy Coppinger that she had an open mind on commissioning a second report. If the money can be found, she said, I will ensure it will be done, if the money can be found. It also seems that Minister Sapone, Minister Doherty, and I'm sure all of the female TDs in the Fine Gael party are behind this. Yet, 15.5 years later, there's no SAVI 2. Moreover, and one has to ask why, and it seems the responses from the Taoiseach and from the Department of Justice are the clue. And while the Taoiseach, and was very welcome, confirmed that he had an open mind to a SAVI 2, he went on to give other responses that the existing statistical evidence that was there was perhaps sufficient, while ignoring the limitations of that European research, which is limited to women only, which is a very small group of people, and many other deficits in that research. He referred to Garda reports, which we all know cannot be relied on. He referred to existing organisations coming up with information. And we know that, for example, Taoiseach, and if you could even hear this part, the Rape Crisis Network announced on the 19th of October this year that it was not in a position to publish statistics on the experiences of sexual violence. It had no longer had the capacity, and so on. And so what I'm clearly asking for you is simply to listen to the majority of parties in this stall who have said, please carry out a SAVI 2. And the problem is that there's a failure to understand on the Department of Justice, because shortly after the Minister confirmed he had an open mind, the Department of Justice reportedly in the paper said no second SAVI would be carried out. Now, There's a fundamental failure to understand that this research was a qualitative piece of research that was absolutely necessary, and is necessary to follow up, to inform debate, to inform the type of services that we'll provide. My time is up.
Thank you, Deputy Minister.
No, first of all, I fully acknowledge the sincerity with which the Deputy is putting forward this, and I think there's no doubt that we need to be legislation and policy in this area has to be informed by the best possible research. I understand that there is a task force which is scoping out this area of research to see whether it would be appropriate and necessary to conduct the sort of review that you say. There are discussions going on between departments. There is a review of the information available already from within departments and the CSO and other agencies to establish the existing research base. And I understand there's consultations with non-governmental organisations to assess this. Obviously, if at the end of that it is clear that we need to undertake additional research into this issue to better inform policy, a decision will be made by government in the normal way. But in such a circumstance, it would be remiss if government didn't make sure that we assessed all of the available evidence to date and make sure that in making a decision and commissioning further work, we have narrowed down exactly where the gaps are and the issues that need to be on which we need additional and new information. And I understand that is the approach being taken. I confess I'm not an expert in this particular field, but I will clearly alert my colleagues to your concern and that this work that's ongoing should be brought to a conclusion as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Minister.
And I don't expect you to be an expert, but I do expect you to take on board the concerns. And if that many TDs and leaders of various political groupings have raised this matter consistently, obviously there's a problem. And we're learning about that problem from the experts on the ground. And I do welcome that you're in consultation now with the experts on the ground. But at this point, there has to be an absolute admission from the government that a savvy type 2 report is absolutely necessary 15.5 years later, so that we can develop policy and develop proper legislation to deal with it within that subgroup. And the Savvy report, and it's important to point out, was men and women. And the statistics are absolutely frightening. And 47% of those that participated, out of 3,200 or 100, confirmed they had never mentioned it to anyone in their lives. The other statistics I don't have time to go into. However, I believe that the obstacle is simply money. Now, if that could be dealt with, and from a government that put 4 or 5 million into a propaganda unit, really it's hard to take it seriously when your own Taoiseach said that a savvy was necessary if she could find the money.
Thank you, Deputy.
So I'd like deadlines at this point.
Minister, to conclude, please.
Well, obviously, I'm not in a position to offer deadlines, but clearly, I've worked in the research field myself. The first thing that you always do is make sure that you survey what is already available before you commission further work to identify the gaps. And I think it is prudent for government to take the approach that's been taken. I should say that it's not holding back very important investment of real resources, like organisations who are dealing with domestic and sexual violence are receiving funding of 22.1 million, and that's increased this year. The Minister for Justice is proceeding with legislation in the field of domestic violence, as you know. So there is ongoing work while the need for this sort of a study is being evaluated.
Thank you, Minister. On behalf of the Rural Independent Group, Deputy Danny Healy-Rae, please.
Thank you very much, Count Corner. Minister, I wish to highlight a number of infrastructural projects that need funding and need attention in Kerry. Indeed, on my last leader's questions, I raised the matter of the need for a new Killarney outer bypass to bypass Killarney and indeed start in Fan 4 and finish up in Lisbegeen. Now, since then, and I highlighted a number of junctions where there's mayhem and slaughter on a regular basis, and particularly one of these was on the loose road where it's the road coming up out of the town and accesses the N22, the present bypass that we have. There's accidents there on a daily basis, and indeed in recent weeks one of our own vehicles was involved in an accident there. Kerry County Council at present are progressing plans to do something with that junction, and I'm asking you to make sure, and we have a junior minister, Brendan Griffin, and I'm asking him to put his shoulder to the wheel to ensure that money is forthcoming to deal with this junction as soon as possible. I also wish to highlight Listroy Bridge. It was built about 200 years ago and now is reduced to one-lane traffic. This bridge is on the R563 road, which goes from Killarney to Dingle, a highly heavily trafficked road, buses, cars and lorries, and at Listroy Bridge they have to stand up and stall up because there's only one-way traffic. I'm asking Brendan Griffin, the minister, the junior minister, he has to, when he's going home every evening, 'tis over this bridge he has to go. Right, but I'm asking Minister Bruton to take the message to him. and you see, Minister Griffin was critical of my father at different times for money that he took down to Kerry and for money that he didn't take down to Kerry. So now the ball is in his court, and I'm asking him to provide funding for the bridge that he's going over himself every day. There's another project that's being progressed, and I'm asking that he ensure to provide funding for it. It's the bins that got to Hanboy on the N72. And there's 1.2 kilometres to be realigned there, and I'm asking for funding for that also to ensure that that's progressed.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, no, I thought you hit the bit. So, in conjunction with that, on the N72, Ballyconnell Bridge is to be realigned and to be widened. So I'm asking that he make sure that there's funding provided for that in the coming months. Glenbehy Bridge to the west of Glenbehy on the N71 is also a bridge that was built 200 years ago.
Thank you, Deputy.
And is reduced to one-lane traffic. That's not satisfactory on the Ringakerry Road.
Minister, I don't know, is that a bucket list or a shopping list?
Well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate Deputy Healy-Rae on what someone described as excellent retail politics. It's very hard to compete with them. My answers will be more in the wholesale area, telling you, what we can do on the national level to try and ameliorate the sort of problems that you list. As you know, the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform, because of the progress we've made in economic recovery, and we are in a position to balance our books this year, 2018, he has announced an increase in the capital programmes over the next 4 years of 73%. So we have a very significant uptake now of the capital expenditure that we can expect over the next number of years. And I think there is a lost decade, effectively, when many needed investments could not be made. And they include, obviously, in roads and infrastructures and bridges, as well as in health and education and housing. So we are in a position to make these investments. But obviously, the selection of them will not be made on the basis of the political hue of the Minister or the Minister of State. It will have to be based on each programme being evaluated in a fair and reasonable way in comparison with similar cases right throughout the country. And that's the approach that has to be taken. So in prioritising expenditure, which will thankfully be much increased in the years ahead, we will have to weigh up all our various obligations, and Deputy Eamon Ryan yesterday alerted us to the obligations in respect of climate change, which also have to inform the selections we make in respect of capital. So while I think I can say that we're looking at a period when there is going to be increased resources for many of the causes that you put forward, I can't make commitments to the individual projects, meritorious and all as they may be, and I'm sure you can understand that.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy.
Minister, these say that he will and that he has money to spend. My trouble is, and my worry is, that it is in Dublin he'll spend it. Yes. Minister Ross signalled that he was spending 135 million on some footpath here in Dublin. I want you to go outside of the Red Cow and go down to Kerry where there's slaughter at junctions, where there's unfairness and where buses and lorries are held up and where lives are being placed in danger because of inadequate junctions and inadequate roads because of the serious increase in the volumes of traffic. I'm asking again, there's money needed for the junction at the top of the Lewis Road. There's money needed for Listroy Bridge to make a bridge out of it because it's not a bridge at the present time. And I'm asking for money and funding for the 1.2 kilometres realignment at Cootehill on the N72. And I'm asking as well for funding for Ballyconnell Bridge to the west of Glenbeigh on the Ring of Kerry Road. I make no apologies, and I'm asking you to make sure that Brendan Griffin knows and is aware of my request and the pressure. I'm putting pressure on him now because he was putting pressure on us when the ball was in our court. It is his turn now, and let him prove what he can do and what he can bring down to Kerry. He'll be measured on that.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Minister, to conclude on this matter.
Looking to Minister Brendan Griffin in respect of our hopes for sports capital grants, and I think that's an area for which he has responsibility. We look forward to him showing his prowess there, and I've no doubt that he will. I think the assurance I can give you is that, in the National Planning Framework that has been published, it is the intention of government that half of all the population growth that would occur will be outside of the major cities. And indeed, the major cities outside of Dublin will be growing at twice the rate of Dublin. So there is a very clear commitment that the infrastructural spines that we will invest in the coming 10 years will be to support much more rapid growth outside of Dublin than we've seen in the previous years. And for the first time ever, we're underpinning a national planning framework with a 10-year capital programme. So we're tying our infrastructural investments to the spatial, the regional strategy. And I think that's the absolutely crucial decision that's been made by this government. It was never done before, and we've seen the consequences of not having clear connection between your capital decisions and your ambitions for spatial planning. And I think that is fundamentally changing on this occasion.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes leaders' questions. We now move to questions on promised legislation. Today we have just 15 minutes for this particular matter. We have already 19 deputies indicating, and I very much doubt that we'll reach them all. Deputy Donnelly.
Minister, page 93 of the programme for government includes a commitment to improving outcomes for every student. A new report being reported today in the Irish media by the Bertelsmann Foundation makes a very sobering reading. It ranks Ireland 21st out of the 28 countries on educational attainment. One piece that sticks out quite starkly, Minister, is the 80% of the working age population having attained at least upper secondary education. Now, I acknowledge that share has gone up in recent years, and I imagine it is something you're looking at. However, we are well below best in class on this. And so, Minister, can I ask you to provide an update on plans that you have for bringing legislation forward to improve the completion rates in Ireland for secondary education? Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to say, we have brought forward a 1 billion extra investment in education, and we have set a target that we will be the best in Europe within a decade. On the issue of early school leaving and dropout, we are now making huge progress. We have seen our position drop from 14th place to 7th. And in respect of people in the age bracket 20 to 24, we now are second best in Europe in terms of those who have completed higher level, second level. So we are one of the best in Europe. Now, I admit that if you look at the older population, we aren't as good, but it's much harder to influence people who are long since out of the education system. So we're putting huge emphasis in our work on DESH, on improving literacy standards. I'd have to also say that Bertelsmann is a very partial view. It doesn't look at, for example, our investment in special education need. It doesn't look at the investment we are putting in bringing 32% more people from disadvantaged backgrounds into our higher education sector. So it is a partial measure, but it does have lessons for us. Our investment in preschool, for example, clearly needs to continue to improve, and Minister Catherine Zabon has put in place a very ambitious programme to do that. A lot of this data is quite old.
Deputy David Cullinane, no, we can't go back.
Minister, in the programme for government, it commits to 10% of all bus routes essentially being privatised and put out for tender. You will know that in Waterford City, 100%, all 5 of the bus routes are being put out for tender, and the outcome of that will be known today. It's in the programme for government as a commitment. So what the question I'm putting to the Minister is this: why 100% of the bus routes in Waterford City? Is Waterford being used as a guinea pig in your privatisation experiment? And would you agree with me that if you privatise and outsource the profitable routes, and these are 5 profitable routes, that will have an impact on the viability of the company, which in turn will have an impact on the ability of the company to provide services in rural areas? And we know that the expressway service in many areas are under threat. So if the Minister can respond to those questions.
Thank you, Minister.
The decision on which routes ought to be selected for tendering is made independently. It's not made by government. But clearly there is a commitment that we would open up the opportunity for competitive tendering for some elements of our public transport services. That allows other providers to offer alternatives, and it is good for the consumer and user to see alternative offerings. Of course, there's no guarantee as to who will win in that tender. The best offer at offering the best service at the most competitive rates will win, and that will be of benefit to consumers who look to improvement. And we have seen, that where there is open competition on the intercity routes, there are now a wide variety of services offering, and they do meet additional consumer needs. So we have to recognise that a monopoly delivery is not the sole way to go. But of course, as you rightly say, certain public services will always have to be supported, and government has made substantial money available to the public transport companies to ensure that we provide social routes as well as economic.
Deputy Brendan Howland, please.
Minister, the programme for government includes a commitment to establish a public service pay commission to examine pay levels across the public service. I think most of us anticipated that the government would adopt a coherent, structured approach to public sector pay. I expressed concern when a much-hyped salary was rumoured for the next Garda Commissioner. I'm even more concerned at reports that universities are now to be given freedom to pay academics up to €250,000. It appears that the government is willing to make exceptions to pay policy, but only at the very top. So can I ask the Minister whether the government intends to continue to make exceptions to top-level public sector pay for the highest earners, and where stands the University Amendment Bill, which would have put a stop to breaches of pay in those particular institutions?
Thank you, Deputy Howland. Minister.
Well, first of all, there is the Public Service Pay Commission is examining areas where there is difficulty in recruiting, and I think the government recognised that, while observing public pay policy in a fair and even-handed way and living within the available resources, we have to be conscious of areas where there is genuine difficulty in recruiting people. And the Deputy will know that such difficulties apply in many sectors, including the health sector and others. But the same policy informs that, where we're seeking to recruit, and in the case of higher education, to recruit world-class researchers who would become magnets to help develop and strengthen our third-level sector, you do have to be willing to pay price necessary to get those. And I think the Deputy himself has always recognised that we do need the best leaders in our public services. And I think government has to show some flexibility in respect of the posts that it's filling and the difficulty in getting the right person for those jobs. So that is the approach that we're taking.
Deputy Matthew McGrath.
Jack and Jill review yesterday, 20-year review, wonderful organisation. The issue came up of the local parenters rule. It's a very hard rule and it's sickest of children in this country, where the Jack and Jill nurses, who are inspirational, come in to give some respite and look after the sick child for an hour or whatever. Now the HSE insists under this new rule that the parent must stay in the house with the child. This is totally, against the spirit of what respite and the very much needed respite for those very sick children is. So this has to be looked at and examined, especially in cases of where Jack and Jill do such wonderful work for children, which is now going to be up to 5. They've increased it by a year, not by government funding, but by money from companies.
Issue, a PQ, I think, Deputy.
Yes, but it's a very serious issue, and it's affecting very sick children.
Thank you, Minister.
Background to this, I'll have to ask the Minister to respond to you.
Deputy Roisin Shortall.
Minister, the School Admissions Bill, as you know, at the committee stage was held last June, and at that you indicated your intention to effectively remove the baptism barrier. A lot of time has elapsed now since then, and I'm just wondering, are you ready to bring forward your amendments in that regard, and what kind of timescale are you working to now for the completion of that legislation?
Thank you, Deputy Minister.
Well, as I think I indicated to the Deputy before, we are working with the Attorney-General's Office to get robust drafting of amendments to deal with that issue and other issues raised in the committee, such as the power for the NCSE to oblige schools in certain circumstances to open special units. Both of those require some careful drafting, and I'd have to say no effort is being spared in trying to get to a conclusion, but they are tricky enough in drafting, and that work is ongoing, and my ambition is to complete it as quickly as possible, but I'm just not in a position to give you an absolute timeline.
Thank you, Deputy. Thank you, Minister. Deputy Tony McLaughlin.
Minister, when can we expect to see the student and parents' charter bill to be brought before the House, and what are the benefits of this legislation, Minister?
Minister.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that we have received a report back from the committee following the pre-legislative scrutiny, and that report back is broadly positive. So we are now going to proceed to the drafting of the heads, and a lot of work has already been done in my department. I think the advantage of a Parents and Students Charter is that it clearly sets out the rights of parents and students as full partners within the school, to access to information, to participate in decision making, to have smooth ways of resolving difficulties, and to have good protocols for resolving those issues locally.
Thank you,
builds a stronger school.
Deputy Robert Troy.
Thank you, Minister, you will be aware that a number of years ago the previous government suspended the motorised transport grant, and it was promised that it was going to be introduced within 6 months. Well, I think it's almost 6 years now, and we're still awaiting the reintroduction to this scheme. It's preventing people with restricted mobility access to a very worthwhile scheme. Can I ask, can we have a definitive timeline as to when we can expect, not more so when we can expect, but when the people who are relying on this scheme can expect the new scheme to be reintroduced?
Thank you, Deputy. This matter is coming up every day.
Yeah, well, I can only repeat the response that the Taoiseach gave yesterday, which I understand he indicated that legislation will be needed to introduce this, and that legislation is in preparation. I don't know what the exact state of play of where that legislation. I don't have that information to hand.
Thank you, Deputy Niamh Smith.
Programme for Government, you give a clear commitment to building a visible and familiar policing presence. In Cavan Monaghan, Minister, we have a rural crime crisis, with homes being broken into in daylight, in broad daylight, their businesses being affected, and particularly farmyards and elderly living in our communities. Community employment schemes where they're doing good in our communities, their equipment all being stolen. Minister, I have to put it to you, in my local district, in 2007 to 2008 we had 12 sergeants. We're down to 6. In our division in 2010 we had 413 Gardaí, now we're down to 330. And Ballyconnell Garda station is a case in point, and with reduced services we are being reduced to reduced hours. So Minister, I would ask you, would you please give a commitment, as you have done in your programme for government, to build that visibility and presence in our constituency?
Thank you. Minister.
Yeah, I mean, I fully recognise that this is an issue of particular concern. I suppose Garda recruitment effectively ended in 2010, and after that there was a continuous decline in the Garda strength, and that did undoubtedly impact on local communities. However, we are now rebuilding the police force, and the Templemore was opened. There's increasing recruits every year. It's operating to full capacity, and if I'm not mistaken, the Minister is committed to a figure of 21,000 for an overall Garda workforce by 2021. 15,000 Garda members, 2,000 reserve, and 4,000 civilians. So, those will be the resources that the Garda Commissioner will have to deploy in the most effective way to support the real concerns that the Deputy is highlighting. Deputy Anne Rabbitte.
Minister, under the programme for government, the government committed the Department of Rural and Community Development, along with the Department of Finance, to investigate the German Sparkassen model, and also to look upon on Post and the League of Credit Unions, as well as other interested stakeholders. Both departments convened this project in early 2017. Early this year. I'm just wondering, when will the report come before us, Minister?
Thank you, Deputy Minister.
I'll have to get the Minister to revert to you. I haven't got that information to hand.
Deputy Shane Castles.
Minister, in July of this year, legislation went through this House to facilitate the hosting of the Rugby World Cup in 2023, which at the time was described by the Minister for Sport, Shane Ross, as the most energising piece of legislation that he had ever introduced in the Dáil, his quotes. Alas, our bid did not seem to have the required energy, place, cricking, or indeed the front row power of Mr Chabal from France yesterday. Given the fact that the government has put a lot of resources, over 1.25 million of taxpayers' money behind this bid, and indeed political capital, can I ask, will we have a report looking at and considering the ballot process that saw us only get 8 votes yesterday, and indeed the entire process of the failed bid? Because we will need to get to the actual root of the fact that if the other nations did not believe our commitment on stadiums in this country, when they looked at it like a Casement Park, where the meadow was growing 6 foot high, well then we need to look at government commitment, at stadium funding right across this country, and possibly looking at the municipal stadium model that they have across Europe, so that our reputation in making bids in the future could be ensured, and we could make a successful bid in the future.
Minister.
Well, first of all, it is disappointing, of course, that we didn't win this. But I suppose every time a ballot goes against us, and I'm sure you've seen ballots go against you yourself, you can't announce that we're going to have an examination as to why we didn't win. Sometimes you don't win these ballots. But I think, the effort of making this bid will certainly help us for the future, and I think there are a lot of lessons will have been learnt. I think in terms of this government, I mean the maintenance of the Sports Capital Grant right through the very difficult years, I think was a very inspired decision, and has helped right across the country communities build facilities that have kept up involvement of people in sports on a very practical basis. And of course this year we have made enhanced investment in those sports capital grants so that more communities can benefit. And really the long term for sport is to see more people actively involved, and we need to see at least half of our population actively involved in sporting activities.
Thank you, Minister. The time has gone. Sorry to the 8 deputies who haven't been reached. We now move to the prohibition of fossil fuels, Keep It in the Ground Bill 2017, first stage, and I call on Deputy Eamon Ryan to move for leave to introduce the bill.
I so move, if I can, Ceann Comhairle.
You have 5 minutes.
If I can explain the background, that it is what it says in the title of the bill, to keep fossil fuels on the ground. And anyone with an interest in climate change, anyone here who would be an advocate that we live up to what we signed in the Paris Climate Declaration, would know that this is exactly what we have to do. The science is increasingly clear. Climate scientists making the obvious case that if we're to avoid the world tripping into a dangerous runaway climate change, we have to keep temperature global rises below 2 degrees. Actually, we have to now, the Paris Agreement went further to say below 1.5 degrees. We already are seeing over a 1 degree increase in average global temperatures. We can burn no more than 600 gigatons of the remaining fossil fuels, and we know that there's more than 2,500 gigatons even in the known reserves before we look for anything new. So we have to keep 4/5 of the fossil fuels underground. In fact, there was a presentation, I'm just back from the 23rd meeting of the Conference of Parties of the United Nations Framework on Climate Change in Bonn this week, and actually the latest analysis is saying even those existing wells and existing mines are going to not be able to finally use all their production if we're actually to meet these climate targets. So for we as a country, this House I think has done a very proper job, a good job in saying we're not going to engage in fracking of gas and oil onshore, but actually we need to go further. We need to go further with the bill, Deputy Pringle's bill, in stopping investment in other companies across the world who are investing in fossil fuels, but we need to go further here at home. And we would not be alone doing this. The French government have indicated their intention of introducing similar legislation where they will not continue with any exploration of oil licence or gas licences in the same Atlantic margin that we are exploring in. So we would not be alone in doing this. In fact, we would be following the lead of France and Costa Rica, but we would be up there with the top 5 or 6 countries in the world in terms of taking this call seriously. And my God, we need such a message because this country is in the doghouse at the moment on the climate issue. It was remarkable in Paris, as I said, in Bonn, rather, as I said yesterday, when you talk to the people involved in this issue, concerned on it, they now mention Ireland with real regret as to why is it you do not show any leadership. Why is it that you, a country with some of the best renewable resources in the world, is holding back so much, is not actually being part of the transition we need to make. And this change is eminently doable. The bill is very concise, it's very easy to implement, and is saying no new licences would be issued. It doesn't affect any corporate interests, because I don't believe there should be an expectation that we should be handing over the area, our sea area, 10 times our land area, just to the private sector as a speculative asset. It's actually our seas to look after. It's our part of this planet, and it's not a small chunk that we have responsibility for. And in banning fracking, in banning offshore oil and gas exploration, not only would we be doing what we need to do in terms of avoiding dangerous climate change, we would also be protecting our local environment, that marine environment. This whole issue of protecting biodiversity is connected to addressing the climate change issue. Because all the latest research and analysis shows that the seismic activity you do in conjunction with exploration, and indeed the work, what you do when you're actually drilling, actually has significant environmental effects. If we want to protect our fisheries, if we want to protect the other marine animal life, actually we need to stop that seismic activity, because the analysis, it interferes in the whole zooplankton life cycle, and we need to protect our environment, not to continue destroying it. This bill would help that happen. We introduced 2 concepts in the bill which are important, or 2 definitions. One, this whole issue of climate justice. And we do have a responsibility. People say, in response to some of the comments yesterday, people say, what can Ireland do? We're only very small, we don't count. Well, we do count. Everyone counts. We as a country count for the equivalent of 400 million of the poorest people on this earth in terms of our own emissions. We as a country, with the responsibility for this area of the Atlantic, this huge area, have a responsibility to start protecting marine life, to stop the ecocide that is taking place across our world. And in terms of climate justice, we have a responsibility to protect those poorest people in the world who are first to suffer. At the climate change conference in Bonn, Trócaire brought together the environmental NGOs and some of the people from different countries who are actually suffering today, who are seeing drought happening today, who are seeing flooding happening today to the poorest people on this planet. And we have a responsibility, rather than bending our knee to ExxonMobil or to Shell or Statoil or any other companies, in Irish companies too.
Thank you, Deputy.
We have a responsibility to actually help stabilise the climate on this planet, to look after the natural world, to support the prohibition of fossil fuels, keeping the Crown Bill 2017. Thank you
very much. Is the bill being opposed? The bill is not being opposed. The motion for leave to introduce is therefore agreed. Could I ask Deputy Ryan to move that the second stage be taken in private members' time?
I so move.
Is that proposal agreed? It's agreed. Thank you very much. We move now to a motion